Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Deborah Schoen, and I work with the Poughkeepsie Public Library District. And Arnie, I knew Arnie from years and years ago. He used to do some exhibits and displays in the library, and he just did one on, I believe, the Negro Leagues.
Jackie Robinson.
On Jackie Robinson with the library. And he said that he had a talk before Jackie Robinson, African Americans in baseball. So Arnie's been a 20-year supporting member of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And he's gonna provide us with a history in the context of the Negro Leagues. And he'll discuss prominent players who never got to play in the major leagues and prominent major league players who got their start in the Negro Leagues. And I believe you're also going to talk about the only woman that's been inducted into the Hall of Fame, the Baseball Hall of Fame, which I'm really excited to hear about.
Sure.
So, Arnie, thank you for hosting this presentation tonight and sharing your expertise with us in the community. And we're really very, very grateful. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start my screen share, my PowerPoint, and let's see, let's do this in slideshow fashion. So you already heard about me. I don't have to say anything more, I don't think. So this presentation is divided into 4 parts. Quite frankly, the longest is the first part. There's probably more history with respect to African Americans in baseball before the Negro Leagues. After all, the Negro Leagues officially didn't start until the 20th century and actually a way into it. With respect to questions, Deb, will you be monitoring the, I tell you what, after each section, how about we pause and we take questions, and perhaps we'll take questions in the chat room, and then I guess we don't have too large a crowd. If somebody needs to ask a question, they can unmute themselves. We could do it that way.
That's perfect, Arnie, because
Okay.
I'm gonna mute myself so that you don't, and nobody hears any background noise in my place.
Okay.
And then we can use the chat, but if somebody, I think everybody has the ability to unmute themselves.
Yes.
And then and then they can ask the question.
Okay.
We only have 16, so we should be good.
Okay, that's good size nonetheless. So I'm going to get started. Here we go. Part 1. I'm not sure that very many people. Oh, by the way, if you see me still, I'm wearing my Homestead Grays shirt in honor of the topic of the evening. I don't think everybody knows that that the history of baseball goes back not only hundreds of years, as I presented in the class I did for Vassar's Lifelong Learning Institute last semester, but we have evidence of participation on the part of African Americans in baseball back to the end of the 18th century. As early, documented evidence as early as 1773. Now, I think it's fairly obvious that a number of things that I'm going to be talking about, presenting, reporting are not, how do I put it, not happy things, because what was happy in those days with respect to African Americans in this country. I'm not going to be political about it, but slavery was slavery. And so it really is a topic that didn't bring joy until a relatively short time ago. In fact, my wife remembers that the moment that we recently celebrated on an annual basis was happened around her date of birth. So we start here, as I said, in 1773, and in a local newspaper in South Carolina, a report that blacks, Negroes in Beaufort, South Carolina, on their Sabbath day, on Sundays, were playing a variety of games, including what very well may have been a baseball type of game. And of course, the evolution of baseball suggests that there were some commonalities in what we call baseball types of games, starting, I'll go back into the 17th century, in fact. But baseball, as we know it today, one might say it's continuing to evolve. I heard some managers complaining about some of the new rules and why they don't like them. So baseball's still evolving. Research has found a number of instances of antebellum, after the Civil War, participation in baseball type games by freed slaves. But we go back even further than that in the early 19th century, not in the South, but in New York State, actually. A newspaper turned up in an archive in a Kingston newspaper of the late 1800s, in which an elderly resident recalled that in around 1820, and this is 7 years before, by the way, the quote, peculiar institution, otherwise known as slavery, was abolished in New York State, that there was participation on the part of slaves here in New York State in a game like baseball. And by the way, that little parenthetical thing on the bottom there, for the history buffs, you probably already know that while slavery was technically abolished in New York State in 1799, it truly did not end because of the particulars in the bill that abolished slavery, that talked about children being born before a certain date and not being released from their obligations until they were nearly 30 years old. The real date, it turns out, was probably around 1827. In bondage, evidence of African Americans playing baseball, or at least a ball game, whether it was baseball. Again, I'll say this probably a number of times, or I'll try not to keep saying it. Always is a question. A school teacher, I think somewhere in here it talks about her as a school marm from the Northeast, went to Georgia to teach in the 1850s. And she wrote a book about it. And in that book, it said the slaves had finished their tasks and were enjoying recreation. A variety of things were done in the name of recreation, trundling a hoop, but some were playing ball. And so there must have been something going on there. And by the way, it's late enough in history to suggest it was something similar to baseball, at least baseball of the time. By the way, this Emily Burke was the school teacher. She was very disappointed with things that she saw in the South. Again, she was from New England, and she left the South, as she put it in her book called Pleasure and Pain, with mingled emotions. There were things she loved about the South, and there were things that she found very disturbing, obviously, about the way people were treated. This I find just amazing. These are two photographs. Obviously, the one on the left has automobiles in it. It was impossible for me, though I searched considerably for photographs as early as possible. This was Madison Square in New York City, where the very, very famous Knickerbocker Baseball Club, generally regarded as the first formal, official, and almost professional baseball club in history, played before they went across the river. That is our river here, a little further south, obviously, to the Elysian Fields in Hoboken. So there were baseball games going on in the 1840s that involved not only the white socialite baseball clubs, but apparently blacks, African Americans, probably free Americans, given the date, that post 1827 date. Again, these photographs are of the area, but not of the time. Whoop, what happened there? I will say that a number of images exist, and some of these are in my collection. This one, for example, this is a product advertisement, and it for a company that made finishes, varnishes, used in all in a variety of ways in New York City. They were located down on West 12th Street. But this image originally came from Harper's Weekly, the so-called Journal of Civilization. Anybody who collects Civil War stuff might know about Harper's Weekly, because Harper's Weekly did a great job of documenting the Civil War from the north point of view. So it was originally a woodcut, but this image was used over and over in a number of ways. In this case, as a product advertisement called, and it was called Baseball at Blackville, originally in Harper's Weekly in 1878. We're having an issue here. Here's another, I want to say, a similar kind of a similar piece, and an advertising piece. I don't have the back to it, so I'm not sure what this advertises. I don't recall. And these are called trade cards. Now, unfortunately, as you've seen already twice, and we'll see, let me do one more. These things, these images, and not surprising given when they were produced. This is from a clothing store in Texas. They poked fun. They poked fun at African Americans, and they poked fun at baseball. And by the way, in the early days, baseball was a brunt of humor. It's obviously, in retrospect, a sad thing. But I have to tell you, these are highly sought after by collectors of not only baseball memorabilia, but early African American memorabilia. So those are examples of trade cards that showed in some way relative to the game of baseball. Here, the very caption of home run, not meaning a home run as we know it today, but running home with the police chasing after a black man in a uniform. So the first African American baseball clubs, as early as the 1840s and 1850s, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. When I lived in Rochester, my wife attended a church that was in a building that had at one time was a music school, and had at one time been a church hall that Frederick Douglass preached in from time to time. And down the street, also an occasional preacher in this building was Susan B. Anthony, a great historic site, in fact. At any rate, in his autobiography in 1845, he said that at holiday time, slave communities engaged in sports, including ball playing, among other things, dancing, fiddling, foot races. And it was very agreeable, not only to the African Americans involved, but to their masters. He was actually a fan of the game of baseball. In fact, his son, Frederick Douglass Jr., played baseball with a team, an integrated team called the Charter Oak Juniors in the city of Rochester, once again, where I spent 30 years of my life. I visited the site. There's a plaque there, as there should be. After the Civil War, Douglass Jr. moved to Washington, D.C. and helped to form or found a baseball club called the Washington Alerts. His brother Charles played with him on that team. He was the third baseman for the team. Charles later on moved to a rival Washington Mutual's baseball club. So we're talking then about the 1850s. A recent in a newspaper archive reference to teams in Newark, New Jersey was found from 1855. A reference in the newspaper about the St. John's and Union colored clubs. Baseball games on a Friday afternoon or on the weekend were a big social event. And by that I mean for the African American community, whether it was in Washington, D.C., in Philadelphia, in New York City, obviously areas where there were large numbers of African Americans who organized into social groups and social clubs. Now, in Brooklyn, my hometown, there were three, and just before the Civil War, there were three well-known at the time prominent baseball clubs. Two of them, the Uniques and the Union, both in the Williamsburg area, and a third, the Monitor. In addition, there was a very unusual, unless you're a historian, and interesting area of Brooklyn called Weeksville. It was a neighborhood. And in those days, the neighborhood was really a village. Just as, in fact, up until the Brooklyn Bridge was built, Brooklyn was the largest city in this country. Anyway, Weeksville, this neighborhood in Brooklyn, with about 500 residents, was established by African Americans who had done well in local businesses and were involved in politics. And so it was I use the word enclave here. What I found fascinating when I did the research and found out about Weeksville is it was my neighborhood. By that I mean the neighborhood that I grew up in the very late 1940s and 1950s. If you're a Brooklyn person, you might recognize some of these streets. Fulton Street of Brooklyn. I lived very close to New York Avenue and Troy Avenue. Sometimes the area was known as East Flatbush. It was not actually Flatbush, so it was far enough away from Flatbush Avenue. and the unknowns of Weeksville were mostly middle class African Americans, and it was a prominent activity and a prominent group of people for the people who lived in this area. I'm not suggesting that these photographs are old enough, as old as they appear. I wasn't able to date them, but these, in fact, were without question photographs of residents of this neighborhood of Weeksville. The one on the left, obviously, a group of young, well, maybe not all that young, baseball players. You could see equipment there. The very fact that there's a catcher's mask suggests it was not as early as the 1840s or 1850s. And the very stylish young women and children of Weeksville in the right-hand photograph. So in 1862, there was an article in a newspaper famous for those of us who were born and raised in Brooklyn, called the Brooklyn Eagle. One of the reporters for the Brooklyn Eagle was a man named Henry Chadwick. Now, without getting too far astray from the topic of African Americans in baseball, Henry Chadwick came from England with his family, his father. His father was a journalist in England, and Henry was very much interested in sports. Obviously, cricket, having come from England. Henry Chadwick got very much interested in the developing American game of baseball and became more than just a sports writer. He became very much involved in the development of baseball in the United States, certainly in the Northeast. In fact, a number of the earliest rules of the game of baseball Henry Chadwick is credited with them. So there was an article in the Brooklyn Eagle. Historians speculate it was written by Henry Chadwick. Apparently, he was supposed to go watch a baseball game that was canceled for some reason, a white baseball game, and he moseyed, so to speak, into the neighborhood, a neighborhood in which the two African American teams, the Unknowns and the Monitors, were playing. Seeing this was a revelation for Henry Chadwick. A revelation in not unexpected in the way he wrote it, when he wrote such a gentlemanly pursuit as baseball. Because remember, the white baseball clubs of the day, they were social clubs. You had to be either employed in the fire department or the police department. There was even a Manhattan-based teachers baseball team, or you had to be wealthy. And so when he said a gentlemanly pursuit as baseball, he was surprised to find blacks playing that game. And his use of the word pickaninnies was, there was a whole lot in the way of vocabulary. In fact, up until very recently, as many of us are learning, this was back in 1862. So that term, it's not a surprise. By the way, it wasn't unusual for very high scores in baseball games back in those days. They went on for hours, a complaint of modern baseball, by the way. And you can see here that one of the players, for example, tallied or was credited with 9 runs. Here is an example of a box score from back in the day. between the unknown on the right-hand side of the box score and a team called the Hessens. They were from Queens. Queens was also a hotbed of early baseball. So the first African-American baseball clubs. A book by Dale Summers, great research, has uncovered baseball clubs formed and in existence in some very interesting places, starting before the Civil War. For example, Black employees of elite clubs in New Orleans, the Pickwick Club, the Boston Club, I find that interesting, the Boston Club of New Orleans. So the employees would form teams, and they took as names the names of their employers. In Atlanta, just after the Civil War, there was a baseball club that the Negroes of Atlanta formed, who played in red pants and sky blue jackets. And by the way, anybody who knows anything, especially if you took my class last year, I had lots of visuals of baseball uniforms in the 19th century. They were very colorful with their bibs and their sashes and their hats and so on and so forth. The Pickwick played a white team called the Lone Star Club in 1869, across the border from Louisiana and Texas. And it's possible in 1869, this was the first interracial game in Southern baseball history. And so throughout the 1870s and 1880s, there were many, many games, mostly informally scheduled among Black clubs, Black teams, and between Black teams and white teams. Interestingly, at that time, apparently there were many white teams that had no objection to playing Black teams. It was simply a matter of having an opponent, having competition. That didn't last forever. In Philadelphia in 1865, the Pythians were founded by two gentlemen, Jacob White and Octavius Cato. These were not just Philadelphians were involved, but they were pretty much all business people, Black business people, middle-class professional people, and they gathered from, let's say, the obvious places. Not only were they a part of the Philadelphia community, but they also came to play from Washington, D.C. and New York City. This happens to be an actual scorecard, a Pythians game. No matter what I did, I couldn't improve the resolution to make it legible, scorecard and rosters. Now, what's unfortunate, not that Mr. Cato became a part of local politics, and he did so to help the cause of Blacks in terms of civil liberties and efforts to gain equality as early as the late 1860s. And by the way, that's not Cato, that's Cato, with two T's, I believe. on election day in 1871, because Caddo was running for a position in the Philadelphia city government, an anti-suffrage Democrat named Frank Kelly killed him, assassinated him, murdered him, motivated to do so by the passage of the 15th Amendment, the suffrage amendment. Again, this happens to be a report of that event, a woodcut from Harper's Weekly newspaper. Octavius Caddo was given homage. That marker, I was at a conference in Philadelphia. I heard about this marker. Of course, I had to go see it while I was there. So he was more than just a baseball guy, a baseball organizer. He was also a civil rights leader back in the day, just post Civil War. The Pythians attempted to join a state baseball league. They called it a convention of baseball. That happened to have met in Harrisburg, and this group denied the entrance of the Pythians to their league, to their organization. But they went beyond that, unfortunately, and yet not surprisingly, because the committee that made this decision recommended the exclusion of more than just the Pythians, but any club. That included even one African-American player. They didn't want to have a discussion. They didn't want to have a debate. They simply came up with a decision. Therefore, I would say they overtly drew the first color line in baseball. Their excuse was if colored clubs were admitted, there would be some division of feeling. What does that sound like? Somebody's feelings would be hurt. Whereas by excluding them completely, nobody's feelings would be hurt. Well, I'm sorry, I read that with judgment. They attempted to gain admission into another organization, the National Association of Baseball Players, which we recognize in the history of baseball as the first actual professional league. They were unsuccessful in that attempt either. So it was suggested by writers in the New York Clipper, another newspaper of the day, that these clubs try and organize a league of their own, a national association of Black baseball players. I jump a bit and make a connection. They were notable forays, is the language I used, to allow African Americans in a more organized way to get into the mainstream of what we then and still do, I think, tend to call America's game. But it wasn't a successful attempt. On the other hand, in the decade, or I should say decades that followed, when there in fact were established so-called major baseball leagues, there were a number of Black ball players who sought to earn a living by playing baseball. Among the pioneers was a man named William Edward White, born a slave. who managed to enroll at Brown University and play on what was at that time a celebrated university baseball club. This is a fantastic photo, and it shows not only the Brown nine, literally there are 9 in uniform, but seated and second from the right, William Edward White in uniform. In 1879, the Providence Grays, a National League club at the time, needed a replacement for a first baseman. In those days, there was no such thing as a farm system. There were no farm clubs. And so the Grays, again, Providence Grays, Brown University, the connection there, invited White to play with them. And he played, got a hit, scored a run, flawless in the field. They beat the Cleveland team, and White then returned to Brown to continue playing, never to play for Providence again. Historic research by a number of people, and especially I'm going to give one of my organizations credit, the Society of American Baseball Research, has suggested that William Edward White was in fact the first African-American major leaguer, not to take anything away from Jackie Robinson. I grew up in Brooklyn. I already said it once. My heroes were named Robinson, Newcomb, and Campanella. But history does suggest, given that he played this one game for a team that was in an established professional league, that White might have been the first. Not of many, but the first. Another African-American baseball player named Moses Fleetwood Walker. Here he is on the Select 9 of the University of Michigan. And as you can see, he's on the ground in a very comfortable pose, third from the right. Sometimes called Fleet Walker. He was one of 2 brothers who went to Oberlin College, played at Oberlin College, and also played at the professional level in the National Association for the Toledo Blues. While in Michigan, he was invited to play for a Cleveland-based team, a semi-professional team. All that means is they got paid by the game. They didn't have contracts. They weren't in a league. This happened to be a team sponsored by a very famous company, the White Sewing Machine Club, back in the day, certainly as famous as the Singer Sewing Machine Club. And I'm not going to stray off, as I sometimes do, on a tangent, because the Singer Sewing Machine Company has connections to the early days of baseball in New York State. At any rate, so the visiting Whites, they ran into a problem before a game with a white club from Louisville, the Eclipse, which eventually became a part of the American Association in 1885. By the way, that's the same American Association that existed I almost want to say forever. And when I was in Rochester, the Rochester team started out in the American Association before the 1900s at the AAA level, but they ran into this problem. As the Louisville newspaper said, players of the Eclipse Club objected to Walker playing on account of his color. There he is in another team photo, perhaps a little more obvious as an African American because he did not have his hat on. The Cleveland team, the white team, protested vigorously and said, "Hey, you know what? He's our regular catcher. We have to have him in the game on our team." Well, the manager held Walker out. The replacement catcher got injured, and early in the game, and the crowd literally started chanting to bring the black player back on the field behind the plate. Walker at first was a bit nervous about this, but finally gave in, even though he had reason to be nervous. Rather than end the game on the spot, he got behind the plate. What good did that do? The Louisville players at that point walked off the field. Again, Moses, Fleetwood, Walker, with professional teams. You might think that between college and forays into professional leagues, that he had sort of a long career in what was more than predominantly white baseball. In a way, he did. It just didn't last very long in any one season. Notice the inscription on his gravestone: Oberlin College, class of '82, first black major league baseball player in the USA. So Moses, Fleetwood, Walker. Now, I can't help but talk about Adrian Cap Anson, the man who, because of his prominence in baseball, had the platform to lead the late 19th century fight against African Americans participating in professional baseball. I would say the greatest position player of the 19th century baseball game. And I have to say position player because many of you know that somebody else who was a pitcher started his career well before the 20th century and had his greatest years in the 19th century. And that, of course, was the winningest pitcher of all time, Cy Young. Cap Anson, however, excelled as a position player, a first baseman. The Toledo Blue Stockings, an early black team, early meaning 1880s, were to play an exhibition game with the Chicago White Stockings. That was the team that Anson not only led, but was at least in part an owner of. Almost ended before it began. Anson simply said, my team's not going to take the field against Walker. He was a businessman. And if the game were called, fans would have left and demanded their money back. So after a great deal of yelling and shouting and arguing, um, I guess Walker came back on the field along with the pitcher, George Stovey, also an African American, to play the game. Here are the players who I mentioned. Actually, this event happened a few years later. I have to correct myself. In around 1887. Stovey on the left, another image of Walker on the right, and Chicago White Sox, Adrian Anson. Yet another baseball pioneer with the Buffalo Bisons Baseball Club, Frank Grant, seated second from the right. He was a light-skinned African American, and it was suggested that, in fact, he was not an African American, but a dark-skinned Spaniard. He had played in the Eastern League before playing in Buffalo, which again, in its day was a American Association team, major leagues, so to speak. And when it was made clear, or when it became clear that he was an African American, he was treated quite brutally. Stories about players who might have made it to third base, in other words, hit a triple. Back in these days, there was no such thing as over the fence, would intentionally not go to third base and instead slide into second with their spikes up high, just to injure Frank Grant. At some point, I guess Frank actually, I think it was barrel staves or staves from kegs of nails from a hardware store that he wore to protect himself from players' intent on spiking this African American. Again, Frank Grant on the Buffalo team, and actually swinging the bat. That was a tough picture to find. Mostly African American photos of African American baseball players were only to be found because they were a member of a team. And of course, every team had their local photographer take photographs. So finding that one was quite nice. It was regarded, by the way, as one of the greatest second basemen, mistreated in a number of ways, called a number of things, but respected for his playing. Reported that he had great range. They compared him to a white second baseman, Freddie Dunlap, that he had great range, quick hands, a strong arm. And basically, it all came to an end shortly thereafter with respect to African Americans in organized baseball. Frank Grant kind of gave up, but not that he had any choice, and started playing with African American clubs that began to spring up at the very end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, including a rather famous club, the Cuban Giants. So, but before we go on, any questions about this century plus of attempts on the part of great baseball players who happen to be Black to play with the prominent white players on white teams of their times? Any questions or comments, or maybe you know something I don't know or haven't mentioned you want to add? If you do have something to say or ask, please unmute yourself. Well, I'm pausing, not hearing anything, and I hope it's not because of a technology problem. I will proceed. Okay. So, on to part 2 and the Negro Leagues. Obviously, a combination of whatever you want to call it, racism, Jim Crow, one and the same probably, forced, as I said, African Americans out of the professional level teams that they might have done very well in, probably would have been done very well in, no reason to believe they would not have. And teams began to form that were not league associated and took on a life of what we now call, or began to call back then, barnstorming teams, traveling around the country, scheduling games with whoever they could. People paid to see them play, and so they got gateway seats. It supported them as individuals, as a team, and it allowed them to play not only the game they loved and were very good at, but to play it against strong competition. And this was not only a something that happened around the United States, but also up north in Canada and to the south in Mexico. They played local Negro League teams. They played professional teams, semi-pro teams, other barnstorming teams, local town teams, industrial league teams, in other words, sponsored by corporations, companies, factories. They played anybody they could, all comers, as this last bullet suggests. And by the way, anybody who would take the plunge, no matter their color. This is not a early 20th century team, but it shows obviously a very famous barnstorming team, the early Monarchs. The Indianapolis Clowns in the lower right. I'm not even Pittsburgh Crawfords on the lower left. Here are some paper, the posters. Did anybody know? I didn't until I came across this doing my research. The Harlem Globetrotters, yes, that Harlem Globetrotters, the basketball team, they also had a traveling barnstorming baseball team. Can you imagine that? And then of course the Zulu Cannibal Giants. My goodness. So here's a list. This isn't all of them. of some prominent barnstorming teams in just past or either very, very, very late in the 1900s. I mean, literally in the 1890s and late 1890s, but more so in the early 20th century, especially the first couple of decades of the early 20th century. You can see the Cuban Stars and the Cuban ex-Giants. You can see Brooklyn was home, even though they were on the road most of the time, to the Royal Giants. Chicago, the Union Giants. Satchel Paige had his own team. The St. Louis Browns, and by the way, the name Browns stayed around for quite some time in baseball. The Tennessee Rats, what a name. And there's that Zulu Cannibal Giants. This is maybe half of the prominent national barnstorming teams. By national, I mean they literally went all over the country. Brooklyn Royal Giants, definitely professionals, formed in 1905. The man who sponsored them owned a somewhat famous restaurant in Brooklyn. Again, they played anybody and everybody who they could. Pre-World War I, they did join a what I believe was the first National League of African American baseball teams, the National Association of Colored Baseball Clubs. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long. And as this suggests, they had teams from around the Eastern United States, as well as Cuba, such as the Cuban ex-Giants and the Cuban Stars of Havana. Here's a rare photo, and obviously not in excellent shape, of those early Cuban Giants of New York. The Union Giants, the Chicago team, by the way, formed by two men, one of whom became rather famous, Frank Leland, in the organization of African American baseball teams for a few decades. And there were always things like teams that split apart, teams that combined. This is an example of a group orchestrated by Frank Leland, when the Chicago Unions and the Columbia Giants got together to form another team, which eventually took on the owner's name, the Leland Giants. The Cuban Stars, Cuban professional baseball players. They barnstormed throughout the United States. They were a member of the United States Negro League, actually, for almost 3 decades. The names changed throughout that time. Gotta love some of the names: the Havana Reds, the Almendares Blues, the Cuban All-Stars. So around 1920, we're talking a few years after the First World War. And by the way, this 1920 has become a prominent date over the past, how long has it been now? Almost 2 years? Oh my goodness. How do you lose track of time in a pandemic? Because this also was around the end, finally the end of the early 20th century flu epidemic. I did a little history research on that. I no longer say Spanish flu because those of us who did that research know that if we had to blame a place for it, we would call it the Kansas flu, because it was on a military base during World War I that the first outbreak of that flu actually started. At any rate, Rube Foster, a player, was without argument the driving force behind this organization. He served as its president, not just organizer, but president for some time. The YMCA building there in Kansas City, Missouri, literally was where he and his fellow organizers met to organize. It was called the Negro National League. It was made up mostly of teams in the South and the Midwest. A few years after it was founded, another African-American baseball league, professional level league, was formed, and that was the Eastern Colored League. Shortly after that, a year after that, in fact, the very first Negro World Series was played between the National Negro League and the Eastern Colored League. Unfortunately, the Eastern Colored League only lasted a few years, but very shortly after its demise in 1928, it reorganized and reemerged as the American Negro League, keeping therefore that two league structure going, and therefore a bit of competition between the leagues. The Depression years, who didn't they hit? Well, maybe somebody, but nobody I knew of, or at least nobody my father knew of. Black baseball was especially hard hit. It was a tough life to begin with. The people who supported it financially were certainly not wealthy people. And the Negro Southern League, among the few that existed, was the only one to survive, but it did so as a minor league. Now, the words minor league are not capitalized, so that says they were minor in stature. They weren't a minor league team associated with any obviously with any professional white team in what by then had been well established as MLB, Major League Baseball Incorporated. A photograph of the famous Birmingham Black Barons. A second Negro National League sprung up in 1933, and it operated for a few years before consolidating, leaving the Midwest and finding its success only in the East. Teams in the South and Midwest again reformed a league of Black players, the Negro American League. So now we have, it says NAL, Negro American League, and NNL, Negro National League. No coincidence. They coexisted all the way through most of the 1940s. In 1949, the Negro National League was absorbed by the Negro American League. It actually still existed to some extent all the way to 1960. Heck, I didn't know this as a kid. I mean, I wasn't that old in late 1950s, but I knew about baseball. I certainly knew about my Brooklyn Dodgers. I knew about Jackie. I knew about Nuke. I knew about Campy, Junior, Jim Gilliam, etc. I didn't know that there was still operating a black major league. And in fact, there's a baseball from that, and a poster announcing a game between a Harlem team and the Kansas City Monarchs. So throughout their existence, the various Negro Leagues, they had held World Series. They had a number, 11, it says here, Interleague Black World Series. They had all-star teams and all-star competition. In fact, the East-West game in Chicago during that period was a huge event, Many considered it more important than the World Series, and I guess reported attendance for one of those games was at 50,000. There again is that first World Series, both teams in 1924. More from that game, or is this another game? No, this is yet another World. Oh, East-West. So this was an all-star. No, this was a World Series game between the Hilldale Eastern League, one of the Carolinas, and the Kansas City Monarchs. Over the decades, there were a bit more than 30 Negro League teams and 10 Negro Leagues. They moved, they consolidated, they changed names. But without a doubt, I'm probably preaching to the choir when I say this. Some of the greatest athletes ever to play the game of baseball participated in Negro baseball leagues. Some got the opportunity to play in what had been, since its beginning, the white major leagues, but some did not. So it's 10 after 8. My part 3 is an approach I've taken to display the names of players who I believe, I'm a statistics geek, so I have used statistics which are very difficult to find and very rare, as well as consensus of opinions of a whole lot of people, journalists, for example, of decades gone by, a whole lot of people smarter than I in terms of their experiences of living through the Negro Leagues. My version of a Negro League, a Negro player fantasy team. I'm going to pause for a moment once again and ask if there are any questions? In fact, let's see, 10 after 8. So I'm going to do an end show. I'll start up again, I promise you. Just to,
Wait, Arnie,
yes,
it says, I know a little bit about baseball. Can you please explain what Barnstormer baseball team means?
literally means getting on a bus and traveling from place to place to play wherever they can get games, whoever they could get games to play against. That was called barnstorming. And again, these teams who did this, they went all over the country. In the earliest days, they didn't have those buses, and they therefore traveled by train. And of course, that presented problems because they were only allowed on trains that had cars designated for colored people. Are there any questions besides that one? Nobody is unmuting themselves to ask a question.
It's Gwendolyn, that was Gwendolyn's question on
Okay.
barnstorming. And then she asks, do you think that any of these teams played any white teams or teams with white players?
Oh, by all means. First of all, they were happy to play anybody. There were also predominantly white teams around the country. Let's say even all white teams around the country that were willing to play against African Americans. For one thing, it was a draw. And by draw, I mean fans. I mean people who bought tickets. And so it was a source of income. So the answer is yes. The answer is yes. I'm not saying every white team was willing, but around the country, especially local teams, semi-pro teams, again, players who had day jobs and, maybe played on weekends, got paid by the game, players who represented their companies. There were mining teams in the mining states. There were iron workers in the in Minnesota that play on baseball teams, and so on and so forth. So the answer is yes. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna start up my.
Arnie, I have one more question.
Sure.
When was the earliest, I'm going to say, book of rules? I mean, you had baseball, some sort of baseball player playing happening down in the 18th century, but is there a book of baseball rules that shows up at some point so that you know that, okay, this is the game of baseball as we know it? I know that there's probably been changes in rules, but do you understand what I
can
mean?
answer that, and I'm going to give you a date off the top of my head, so I could be off a few years either way. Mr. Chadwick, that Mr. Chadwick, who I said sometimes is called the father of baseball, from England, when the White National Association of Professional Baseball started, 1870s, over a period of 2 or 3 years at annual conventions, headed up a rules committee and essentially developed the rules of baseball. Now, have they changed over the years? By all means. They've changed in many, many, many ways, but I got to tell you, the basics have remained the same. Distances, the number of bases, the scoring of runs. I mean, I could rattle off a whole lot of things that I think you get the point. The things that have changed have been part of the evolution of baseball. I might point out a couple in our lifetime. The designated hitter, and by the way, let me say boo to that. And again, I heard a manager recently complaining about this new, what is it, a 3-batter rule for pitchers? Yeah. So there have been rule changes. I think there will continue to be rule changes. But I would say from the 1870s on, the game's rules, they just haven't changed that much. Yes, size of bats, weight of bats, how the baseballs are made, but that's a kind of evolution that is more about equipment than about rules. So 1870s, Henry Chadwick and his committee. I wish I could go into a flea market somewhere and find one of those booklets sitting somewhere. I think all the treasures are gone. Too many smart people with a lot of money have bought all those things up. Any other questions?
Arnie, this is Marilee.
Yes.
I don't know if you can see me because all I see is your screen.
You know what? I haven't gotten rid of my, I'm still screen sharing.
Oh, okay. Well, I was going to show you that someone mentioned in the comments, just as my husband handed me a copy of a movie, Bingo Long, Traveling All-Stars and
Yeah.
Motor Kings, about the Negro Leagues.
Yes, I do remember that. I should dig that up somewhere. And I know I have it in my basement. Actually, I also have all 10 episode CDs of Ken Berg's baseball. And I really ought to start at the beginning and watch that again. But yes, Bingo Long, yep. You know, there are lots of great baseball movies. I'm sidetracked for just a moment, but it's okay because I'm looking at my watch. I think I'll be okay. What is really sad to me is the movie about in terms of the topic for tonight, the movie devoted to the I'm going to have to back up. The first movie devoted to Jackie Robinson was so sad and so poorly done. God bless Jackie, he starred in it. It wasn't well done. It was almost amateurish. What's her name was played his wife? Not Eartha Kitt. Sorry. The more recent movie, 42, was a much better example of cinema. And of course, the guy who played Jackie Robinson in that, a marvelous actor with a tragic Chadwick Boseman end of life story. Lots of great baseball movies have been made. How do they get on that? Okay, unless there are any more questions, I'm going to go back and finish up. So let's see. I need to slideshow and go back to where I was. Slideshow and whoops, come on. Where's that? Home and insert home, transitions, design, slideshow. Where's the one that allows me to start right there? Goodness gracious. Just when I think I have it mastered. Not transitions, not draw, not insert. I want to get rid of, it doesn't matter, but I want to enlarge the share comments.
Try to.
Go
try
back to the
go-
slideshow on the top. Click on slideshow.
Hold on, I did that once. Oh, there it is. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Play from current slide. Okay, here we go. So this is my team, my fantasy baseball team. I'm going to go through it somewhat quickly. Major League Baseball, as you probably know, if you don't, here it is, 2020, has decided to classify the 7 historic Negro Major League teams as Major League teams. No more differentiation. And while statistics are tough to get, a whole lot of research is going on to gather as much information. I mean data, I mean details. Stories and legends, well, they're worthy, but a lot of work is being done now by a whole lot of people to get as much of the original statistics as possible. 3,400 thereabouts players of the Negro Leagues over those, well, let's say 28 years. So I'm going to show you my fantasy team. I'm excluding players who went on to have careers in Major League Baseball. I'm making this strictly about players who never got a chance. Following the rules of the fantasy baseball leagues I've been a part of since the 1980s, there will be 23 players. The positions are designated, the number of pitchers, and so on and so forth. If it's a National League team, we call the 23rd player the utility player. If it's an American League, Fantasy League, it's a DH. So here I go. My catcher. Oh, one more thing. At the top, you see my number 1 catcher. A fantasy team generally has 2. One is a backup. Josh Gibson. Now, the number 2 after his name says that, in my opinion, and the opinion of all those, all the research I did, experts, so to speak, Saber and the Hall of Fame and ESPN and so on and so forth. Also, the number 2 player in the history of the National League. So I have my position, the player, and then in parentheses, a ranking of my top 25. Again, I've excluded anybody who had a chance. Everybody said that his home run swing was monstrous, that both in terms of distance and numbers, there's no way of yet of proving that. On one hand, on the other hand, there's no reason to suggest that it wasn't true. Buck Ewing has talked about him. Many of the Satchel Paige talked about him. Many of the players who played with him and were alive during our lifetimes have agreed in terms of position players, batters, hitters. He was up there. There he is behind the plate with that catcher's mitt at bat. And of course, that is his plaque. I said I was going to go fairly quickly so we don't run over. At first base, Buck Leonard, ranked player number 5. He actually played longer for one team than anybody else in Negro League history. When you think about it, if he was the 5th best, and Gibson was as good as he was, one might say they were the Negro League equivalent of what was it, Larrapin Lou and Barrel and Babe, I forget, for the Yankees. A fielder, a hitter. Many people considered him the most likely, given his tenure in baseball, to break the color barrier before Jackie Robinson. It just didn't happen. It just didn't happen. Maybe there needed to be a Branch Rickey before the Branch Rickey of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Graceful at first base, graceful with the bat. Second base, tough position to fill on a Negro League All-Star team. Often a guy who played second might have also been a pitcher, or he might have been an outfielder who was playing second base every third game or every other day. Also, I hate to say this, when I think about second basemen in modern baseball, I can name a few great ones, great hitters, just not as many of those as I can first baseman and third baseman and outfielders and even shortstops, given the Cal Ripken feats. So I go with Martin DeHego, my 15th best Negro League player. Very versatile. Was obviously, given the name, maybe not so obviously, I don't know, of Hispanic descent. He was a Cuban. And you might say I could put him on my team as a pitcher instead of a second baseman, but I needed a second baseman. And I'm looking at this from the vantage point of a fantasy baseball player. Third base, Ray Dandridge, known to have quick reflexes and sure hands. Monty Irvin, obviously one of the more modern, so to speak, Negro League players, in that he's not on my list because he had some prominent years in Major League Baseball. Very dependable, but I guess he was a dazzler with a leather. That's a great way to describe him. Maybe the let's say Brooks Robinson of the Negro Leagues, also a good hitter, a line drive spray hitter apparently. After he had a pretty good career in the American Negro Leagues, he went to Mexico and played for 11 seasons in Mexico. Mexico, along with Cuba and Puerto Rico, were quite welcoming to American Negro baseball players. So that's Ray Dandridge, my third baseman, player number 14. John Henry Pop Lloyd, wow, ranked number 4. nicknamed the Shovel. Great fielders often have great nicknames because of their fielding. And I know that Honus Wagner was famous for this. That's why I put that in here. He would scoop up tough balls and sometimes have to pick the ball out of his mitt, out of a pile of dirt to throw it to first base. Retired with a pretty high baseball batting average. According to what data we have, played a very long career. And on several occasions, we do have statistics that show him being a 400 batter. So that is Pop Lloyd. I love the uniform on the left and the hat style. And it also is portrayed in his on his Hall of Fame plaque. Player number 6, my first of 5 outfielders, Oscar Charleston, a power hitter who could also lay down a bunt and steal a base. Therefore, a great all-around player. He was famous for playing a shallow center field and being able to turn very quickly and outrun deeper fly balls to center field. Turn quickly and throw to the infield or even farther. In 1925, the statistics we have suggest that he batted 451, 20 home runs. That's a lot of home runs given the ballparks that most Negro Leaguers played in. Also went on to become a player manager and a scout who made recommendations on the players to be considered if and when considered for Major League Baseball, if and when that happened. And of course, making those recommendations to none other than Branch Rickey. I love the pose in the left-hand photograph, Oscar Charleston. Outfielder number 2, Turkey Stearns, my consensus player number 8. Satchel Paige paid homage to Stearns and his hitting ability, thinking he was as good as Josh, as good as Gibson. He also had some personality, a 5-tool player, and a many-time All-Star selection with respect to Negro League All-Star teams. Cool Papa Bell said he could hit the ball as far as anybody. Given some of the other players we've heard about already, that's saying a lot. But Cool Papa Bell saw him. I have no reason to doubt that. So Turkey Stearns in my outfield. Also in my outfield, Cool Papa Bell himself, player number 9. A lot of comments from Satchel Paige about the great players of the Negro Leagues that he either had as teammates or played against. Then again, Satchel Paige was known for talking it up. Not only was Satchel Paige one of the greatest, quite frankly, but he also talked a good game. He played a great game, and he talked a great game. Cool Papa Bell was as it says here, a switch hitter, a bat control guy, not necessarily a slugger, but he could take the extra base because of his speed. He played with some great teams, famous teams in the Negro Leagues in the United States, and he spent his winters in either Cuba or Mexico, Southern California. When you think about that, he played 2 seasons, as did many of these guys, because they loved the game, because they were welcome, because they needed to earn the money. And who knows how many games some of these Negro League players ended up playing in any given year because of that. Cool Papa Bell, great outfielder. Yes, I remember getting his autograph, and I want to say he might have been the first Negro League player whose autograph I got. And although I was very young, I had a sense of what this meant. I was meeting and getting an autograph of somebody who was a star in the Negro Leagues. Unfortunately, I never got to meet Jackie. I met Rachel. I met Jackie's daughter. But I got to see him play. But this was Cool Papa Bell, who was sitting in front of me, smiling and autographing something for me. I think it was a Hall of Fame plaque. Cristobal Toriente. You wouldn't know how good he was as a fielder looking at him, because he was kind of a stocky guy, but he played center field. Great hitter, a 5-tool guy, had power, good fielder, great arm, good runner. He was prominent in the early success of the Chicago Giants, the American Giants, and their 3 early National Negro League pennants. Won a couple of batting titles in those years. Moved over to the Monarchs, moved over to the Stars, moved over to the Union Giants, the Black Crackers. What am I doing? I'm painting a portrait of what, in fact, the life was like for not all, but many of the Negro League star players. That is to say, they moved a lot and they played for a number of teams. Obviously, Toriente spent his winters in his homeland and won a couple of batting titles there, having well over a 300 lifetime batting average in Cuba. Cristobal, accent on the O, Toriente. My 5th outfielder, Willard Home Run Brown. Josh Gibson had a great regard for him, calling him to the Monarchs of Kansas City in 1935. Was a formidable batter and a speedy outfielder, center fielder. He served in the Army during World War II, and he was on one of those boats, one of those ships that crossed the English Channel during D-Day during the invasion in 1944. All the way to 1958, played baseball in the minor leagues the Texas League, and at the age of 39, hit 35 home runs and drove in 120. Amazing career. My fifth outfielder, Willard Brown. I guess he spent some time behind the plate because there he is on the right-hand side, strapping on the gear. Willie Devil, now fantasy teams always have an extra corner infielder and middle infielder. Willie Wells, player number 12 in the ranking list, is my middle infielder. Was a good hitter, had some power, and as shortstops often are, was fast and had a great arm. Played not only in the American Negro Leagues, but in Canada, Mexico, Cuba. I keep saying those same things over and over. Down in Cuba, because of his acrobatic play at shortstop. Shades of Ozzie Smith, I guess. He was called El Diablo, the devil. And the word was, try and hit it to the right side of second base. If you're going to hit a ground ball, keep it away from El Diablo. Willie Devil Wells. My corner infield, Mules Subtle, a great player. He was rather famous for the heft of his bat. That 50-ounce bat that he used is probably indicative of the power he had, that, according to statistics, gave him credit as being the all-time Negro League home run hitter. Now, that whole more than Josh Gibson thing, again, we don't have all the statistics, especially on Josh Gibson. We're not saying that that Mule Suttles hit home runs more frequently than Josh, but there apparently are enough statistics over a long career to give Suttles some credit for the number of home runs. Good average hitter also, laid back in personality. And so, as this says here, didn't get the ballyhoo that Josh and especially Satchel, a teammate, got. Not a talkative guy. And if he was around Satch, maybe that's why. I'm not making fun of Satchel. Again, he was a great personality. And Mule was a great teammate. You could see that upper body. You can see the broad shoulders. The power was there. The physical power was there. My second catcher, my backup catcher, Biz Mackey. He was obviously overshadowed in his later years by in his earlier years by Josh Gibson, in his later years by Campy, and so people often forget him as a great Negro League catcher, but was great in his era. Played for Hilldale, Philadelphia, Newark for 25 years, and actually went on to become a manager in the Negro Leagues. In fact, at the age of 40, as it says here, in 1938, I'm going to guess maybe he had a pointer or two to give to the youngster with whom he shared the catching duties for the Baltimore Elite Giants, and that is the 16-year-old Roy Campanella. That's Biz Mackey, my second. By the way, Hilldale. I've said it several times. I apologize for not identifying the team as it. Hilldale was in Maryland. Hilldale, Maryland, where the child named Roy Campanella got his start. Okay. So my selection is pitcher number one is the somewhat argued but often selected by consensus Satchel Paige. So I don't want to say I broke my rule. Maybe I did a little bit. My rule of not featuring in this team of mine anybody who clearly had a shot in the majors. Okay, so I broke my rule a little bit. I couldn't leave Satchel Paige out. I believe the most prominent pitcher and the most prominent Negro League player. When did he make it into the major leagues? With the Indians at the age of 42 in 1948, not all that long after Jackie with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Amazing. While he didn't pitch a whole lot of games, he was 6-1 that summer, and was the first African-American pitcher in a MLB World Series. I think you know that he got on the field at whatever his age was, well into his 50s, just as a, I don't want to say gimmick, but a kind of a commemorative thing. Satch, phenomenal player. Yes, it was with Kansas City in 1963. An amazing player and an amazing personality. Pitcher number two, Rube Foster, a great player, ranked number 7 on my list. A very dominant career as a player as well as manager, and therefore, again, that recognition as the father of black baseball. Started way at the beginning of it all, and in that year 1902, apparently won 44 games in a row. Great player, granted dead ball era, but he went on to make contributions to African-American baseball in so many ways. Set the wheels in motion for Negro National Leagues, and went on to make great contributions as a player, as I've already said. Notice they have him in his in his typical pose, well-dressed, very dapper on his plaque, because he was featured more as an executive. And quite frankly, I believe that he was first selected, he was selected for the Hall of Fame as an executive, not as a player. Joe Williams, my third pitcher. Great drawing card, very popular player. I love this. Carried a baseball in his pocket everywhere, slept with it under his pillow. And he was, again, as a barnstormer, playing teams that had some phenomenal, great players. He has recorded wins against Walter Johnson, Chief Bender, Grover Cleveland, Alexander. I'm sorry, two of those guys, they might be two of the greatest pitchers, no, two of the greatest players in baseball history. Ty Cobb said if he were in the major leagues, he would be a sure 30-game winner. Ty Cobb wasn't known for tossing around compliments. Whoop, didn't mean to do that. I'm having trouble here. There we go. Ty Cobb is famous for being a tough guy. Late in his life, although Williams never got a chance, he was quoted as saying, "The important thing is that the long fight against the man has been lifted. I praise the Lord. I've lived to see that day." That was 1950, obviously a couple of years after Jackie. So Smokey Joe, also known as the Cyclone. I'm running out of time. I hope I can go over a few minutes. Let me move a little more quickly. My fourth pitcher, Bullet Rogan, rather. 19 seasons with the Monarchs. Actually played for the all-black 25th Infantry team in the service way back in post-World War I, maybe in World War I. Had a great record as far as we can substantiate it. And apparently, he had a repertoire of pitches. You don't hear that detail that much about Negro League pitchers. He threw curveballs, he threw palm balls, he threw fork balls, he threw fastballs, and of course, why not? He threw spitballs. Had a .338 batting average to go along with that, and was a slugger. In 1 year, 13 home runs, 199 RBIs, at least documented. Bullet Joe Rogan, hardly ever called Wilbur. William Foster, Bill Foster, he was actually Rube Foster's half-brother. He was a great pitcher, probably the best lefty in Negro League history. Jacko Conlon, perhaps the most famous umpire, also a Hall of Famer in baseball history, likened him to Herb Pennock, a great Hall of Fame pitcher. While he could throw the fastball, he also had a repertoire: curveball, slider. You don't hear about sliders in the early days. It seems like all you hear about these days is sliders and fastballs. And a change of pace, sounds like a change up to me. I would say that's a repertoire given the early years he played in. Bill Foster. Leon Day, great fielder pitcher. Some people have likened him to Bob Gibson and suggested that he was competitive with Satch, who I've already declared the best of the best. There was a point in Major League Baseball history when it was thought that he would be getting a tryout with the Pittsburgh Pirates. Yes, that's the Pittsburgh Pirates of Major League Baseball. there was some talk in the newspapers, the Pittsburgh newspapers, that they were considering giving tryouts to several black ball players. Unfortunately, that never happened. And he died never having a chance. And also, he died just a few days after his election to the Baseball Hall of Fame, Leon Day. The plaque has a smile because he was kind of famous for his smile. Pitcher number 7, Hilton Smith, played in the shadow of a teammate, Satchel Paige, when the two were with the Monarchs. What sometimes happened is Satch would begin to pitch a game because people paid for their tickets to see Satch play, and he would take himself out of a game, and Hilton Smith would come in to finish the game for him. Played in the shadow, as I've said. Monty Irvin lauded his curveball and described it as something that fell off the table. I heard that in a baseball game on TV just the other day. He also was doing some scouting for the Monarchs, and he said I think it was shortly after or shortly before I got to get my date straight, World War II. There's a kid you should sign for the Monarchs. I think he's going to be pretty good. His name is Jackie Robinson. Hilton Smith. Eighth pitcher, Ray Brown. I'm looking at my watch. It's getting close. He was proclaimed at one point also as one of the Negro Leaguers that, if they were given the chance back in the 1930s, would be a shoo-in to be starters. That group included Bell and Gibson, Buck Leonard, and Satch. He was also one of those year-round players, and even found time, I guess, in between, to pitch up in Canada. They had a league in Canada, a welcoming league. Ray Brown, Andy Cooper. He's at pretty much the bottom of my list. But then again, I got to come up with 23 players out of my top 25. Given credit for being the best player ever to pitch in Detroit, and that credit came even in modern times, although there's a guy who's no longer with Detroit who is a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame, I think, who some would argue was their best ever. And he managed the Monarchs to 3 pennants in 4 years. Andy Cooper. My DH or utility man, Judy Johnson. A Negro League MVP, played for the Hilldales and led them to a few pennants, and eventually became player manager for the Homestead Grays. So there you have it. Just quickly, the numbers on the left represent the order of players, in my opinion, and the opinions of all those who I researched. I took Satch off my #1 spot, and you can see these guys are all on my team. That's the first 10. The second 10. My hope is that research on the part of my colleagues in the Society and the Hall of Fame, by the way, we'll get more and more statistics on all of these players, and there's 21 through 25. And of course, my apologies to other players who I personally did not choose for my top 25. My very last part, it's just a few minutes worth, so I guess I'm almost on time. Great players of Major League Baseball who began their careers in the Negro Leagues. Let me see, did I rank them? Well, if I ranked them, it could be that the first name should be that of the guy I consider to be the greatest baseball player of the second half of the 20th century. Let's see. Oh, yeah, Willie Mays, who started with the Birmingham Black Giants. In my opinion, the greatest baseball player in my lifetime in the second half of the 20th century. Now, you could argue the second name on the list, but I'm talking about players who got their start, even if it was a short start, a year or two in the Negro Leagues. It would be easy to say Hank Aaron would be among those qualifications, with those qualifications, is #2. I don't think I'd get very many arguments there. And he certainly lasted a long time. Not only was he great, his RBI totals, his home run totals, and so on and so forth, but he endured. I give credit for that. Okay, it's a beautiful day. Let's play 2 Ernie Banks. And by the way, there are people who argue with me and say, well, yeah, but he played all those years at first base. Ernie Banks' greatest years, both with the bat, with the glove, a Gold Glover, as well as his 2 MVPs, came during his tenure at shortstop. He was the shortstop slugger before we even knew who Cal Ripken was. And of course, Roy Campanella, tragic shortening of career. You know, it's a tragedy that he didn't get to play until he was quite a bit older than he should have been. What happened after his 10th year, the automobile accident was tragic. The dominant catcher in the National League, I say that in deference to all you Yankee fans, in the 1950s, 3 MVPs in 10 seasons, 241 home runs in 10 seasons, 42, held a record for home runs by a catcher for decades. And I don't want to say it was a coin toss on Branch Rickey's part with respect to who would be brought up from Montreal first. He had a choice. He had a choice of Don Newcombe, of Roy Campanella, and of Jackie Robinson. It's a whole other story why it was Jackie Robinson. Had to do with personality, had to do with what Jackie had already endured in his life that might prepare him for what he would endure. But I got to tell you, in my 10 years here in Poughkeepsie, in the senior league, after my legs, my knees, my arthritis said, nope, you're not playing second base anymore, I went behind the plate, and I always had Roy Campanella's number on my back. Another Hall of Famer, Willie Mccovey, 500 plus home run hitter, many seasons of MVP votes with having and a winner of that award back in '69. And in that year, he was intentionally walked 45 times. That record stood until almost the 20th century. Larry Dilby, also a Hall of Famer, great player, became the second African American in the major leagues. Look, let's face it, the American League was a little bit slower to bring African Americans onto their teams. I'm saying it, I'm not trying to make a point, it's not a criticism, but it's the way things went. Oh, by the way, he also was the first African American to play in the ABL, otherwise known as the American Basketball League, before there was an NBA. Quite an athlete. And Monty Irvin. Monty, we all know, got a few years in with the Giants, and had a very prominent 1951 season, third in the league in MVP voting due to 24 home runs and 120. What a great year he had. Once again, if Branch Rickey hadn't made the decision he made, I think Monty would have been the first African American in MLB. Let me toss a few other names out. They're not Hall of Famers. Elson Howard, great behind the plate and then first baseman for the Yankees with 12 All-Star appearances and an MVP. The Cuban Comet, Minnie Minoso, 3 Gold Gloves, a number of times top 5 MVP vote getter, rather famous for his outfield play, sometimes considered reckless. Don Newcomb, Nuke used to be my favorite trivia question. In other words, who's the only one who won a Rookie of the Year award, a Cy Young award, an MVP award? His best season was better than Whitey Ford's best season. That always stirs a little angst between the Brooklyn Dodger and Yankee fans. And of course, that was Don Newcomb. Just didn't have it career lengthwise, but meteoric in his early years. And Maury Wills, I mean, how many stolen bases, and how prominent he was, certainly in Los Angeles, for the success the Dodgers had in their early years. Oh, who else did he play with? I think he played with Don Newcomb and Gil Hodges, who also went to, and wait a second, who was in center field for the Los Angeles Dodgers in their early years? Duke Snyder, the Duke of Flatbush. Sorry, I do get carried away. So I'm going to close by talking about, I'm going to show you first Effa Manley. and her Hall of Fame plaque, the only woman in the Baseball Hall of Fame with a plaque. Yeah, there's a great room that has great displays about the women baseball players of the movie, A Field of Their Own. Manley grew up in Philly, but following high school, moved to New York. She would attend games way back in the late 20s and early 30s to watch Babe Ruth. She was very involved in social organizations and causes. Walked one of the first picket lines that could have been considered part of a civil rights march in 1935, part of the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign. She met her husband at let's see, 32, sure, at Yankee Stadium. He was a bit older than her, no, a lot older than her. And he had been established as a baseball man. Yeah, he was somewhat wealthy. They became partners in the ownership of the Newark Eagles that, by the way, started out as the Brooklyn Eagles, the same name as that newspaper, and eventually did sell the team. But she became so prominent in baseball as a businesswoman, and she really did a lot of the business. I mean, the bookkeeping and the paychecks and so on and so forth, as well as weighing in on real baseball decisions that she was inducted as a baseball executive into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Yes, the plaque is in the same baseball plaque room with all the players. That's Effa Manley. Okay, I'm done. Stop share. Here I am. If you're still here, I see some people are still here.
Well, thank you so much, Arnie. We really appreciate you. Before we sign off, does anybody have any questions?
I just to thank Arnie again for a great presentation.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. And thanks, Arnie.
Bye.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.